Jim Parsons was on top of the world. His character Sheldon Cooper was the most important part of The Big Bang Theory, helping it pull 18 million viewers per episode. He was making $1 million every time the cameras rolled, and Forbes literally calls you the highest-paid television actor on the planet. Then Jim was offered a mind-blowing contract of $50 million written on it. All he had to do was just play Sheldon for a few more seasons, but Jim said no. And it's because of this dark reason connected to The Big Bang Theory. Summer 2018 was supposed to be routine for Jim Parsons, but it wasn't. What happened during those brutal months between seasons 11 and 12 was a collision of life events so intense, so overwhelming that Parsons himself called it almost cosmic. Everything hit at once, and by the time the dust settled, the longest-running multi-camera sitcom in television history was finished. Let's start with the heartbreak. Jim had 2 dogs with his husband, Todd Spiewak. They'd raised them together since Jim was 31 years old. One of those dogs, which was 14 years old, was dying. During this time, Jim was in New York City, grinding through 8 Broadway shows per week in The Boys and the Band revival. But he wasn't just on Broadway. He'd fly back to Los Angeles whenever filming required it, then return to New York for another week of performances. The schedule was absolutely brutal and his dog's health was deteriorating fast. Had described one walk in the park right before a commercial shoot. The dog looked terrible. Parsons was exhausted, emotionally wrecked, barely holding it together. His husband Todd reminded him they had commitments, that everyone had rearranged their schedules to accommodate him. And Jim just broke down crying because he wasn't there for the dog he had shared 14 years of his life with. But what choice did he have? At this point, Jim was at the peak of his career. He wasn't just a TV star. He was a star, and everyone in Hollywood wanted a slice of his star power. Jim kept juggling work and his commitment to his dog, and he and Todd had to make the heartbreaking decision to euthanize their beloved pet at home the following day. At this point, this looked like an incident Jim would be able to put behind him, but he couldn't. And just as he was dealing with the loss of his dog, something else happened. Days after putting his dog to sleep, Jim was back in stage performing The Boys and the Band, and he fractured his foot badly. Still, he didn't stop the performance and powered through the entire show in severe pain. He went to the hospital afterward and realized something chilling. The human body is fragile and it breaks without warning. This was an actor who needed mobility for his roles, and here he was nursing a potential career-ending injury. Jim felt like he was staring into an abyss. What would have happened if he couldn't get back on stage? What would the producers do? How would he handle failing everyone who depended on him? But he recovered and got back on stage. However, the thoughts of his own fragility still remained and it terrified him. And then the real terror set in. Here is where it gets darker. Jim's father died when he was 52. At that time, Jim was only 26 years old. In 2018, Parsons turned 45. Hester did doing the math. By the end of a potential season 14 contract, he'd be 47 years old, only 5 years away from the age his father never reached. I'm not superstitious or anything like that, Parsons explained during his podcast appearance. It was just a context thing, context, that's what he called it. But what he really meant was mortality, the clock, the finish line nobody talks about, but everybody fears. His father never made it to 53. What if Parsons only had 6 more years? Did he want to spend those years, those precious, irreplaceable years in the same soundstage wearing the same superhero shirts? The question haunted him, and he desperately searched for answers. Looks like Sheldon doesn't know everything after all. Meanwhile, Todd kept pushing for them to start new creative projects together. They'd founded That's Wonderful Productions back in 2015, and it had already signed a major overall deal with Warner Brothers Television, but Jim was never available. He was always filming, always performing, always committed to something else. Todd wanted to create and actually use this production company he'd started. But Jim was stuck in a contract that made him shoot 8 episodes of The Big Bang Theory in Los Angeles in about 22 weeks of filming. He was also on Broadway doing 8 performances every single week in New York. Then, as if that wasn't intense enough, he signed on for the Netflix-limited series Hollywood, where Hep played Henry Wilson. That's another several weeks of intense shooting. Jim was flying coast to coast, constantly memorizing different scripts, inhabiting completely different characters, all while maintaining the precision timing required for both television and live theater. On top of that, he had a commercial contract with Intel that required him to work during what should have been his week off. He was exhausted. His body and mind screamed for rest. All his commitments together had completely drained him. Then he began to question if he would be able to give more years to the Big Bang Theory. It was time to stop. In August 2018, Jim returned to Los Angeles after that nightmare summer in New York. He'd been carrying this decision around like a weight for weeks. He knew what he had to do. He went to Chuck Lorre's house on a Sunday. Chuck Lorre is the co-creator of the Big Bang Theory. Jim sat down and told Chuck he wasn't signing for seasons 13 and 14. Chuck understood immediately, and according to multiple sources, he was supportive, even compassionate about the decision. But he also pointed out the reality that both men already knew. The show could not continue without Sheldon Cooper. The entire premise, the title itself, The Big Bang Theory, referenced Sheldon's work in theoretical physics. No Sheldon, no show. Chuck didn't try to change Parsons' mind. He didn't throw more money at him. He just accepted it. And a few days later, Jim gathered the cast in his dressing room after a table read: Johnny Galecki, Kay Cuoco, Simon Helberg, Kunal Nair, Mayim Bialik, and Melissa Rauch. The people he'd worked with for over a decade, his television family. He told them the same thing he told Chuck. Everyone cried. Later, Johnny Galecki admitted to feeling blindsided. Not because of Jim's decision itself, but because Jim went to the creators first instead of talking to his castmates beforehand. They were like a family at that point. And Jim should have gone to them first. Maybe if he had, he would have known Johnny was tired, too. Johnny was already having doubts about performing well after so long, too. Even the people who initially felt hurt by the decision eventually realized Jim might have been the only one brave enough to say it out loud. CBS and Warner Brothers made the announcement on August 22, 2018 that season 12 would be the last. The longest-running multi-camera sitcom in television history was ending. Not because of ratings, those were still massive. Not because of creative exhaustion, the writers still had stories to tell, but because one actor, the heart of the show, simply said no. So, it wasn't just a single scene making Jim quit the show. It was a combination of different things, and how the scenes off The Big Bang Theory were no longer as fresh after being on air for so long. However, that length had made the cast feel like the show was a part of them. Kay Cuoco posted on Instagram that she was drowning in tears. Mayim Bialik wrote about the bittersweet gratitude she felt. The entire entertainment industry went into shock, and people started asking questions. Why would he walk away? What could possibly be worth giving up that kind of money and success? Here's where things get messy. Reports started circulating that CBS had offered Jim $50 million for 2 more seasons. That number got repeated everywhere in every entertainment outlet until it became accepted as fact. But Jim himself later clarified something important. There was actually no such contract, and Jim hadn't said no to that kind of money. If he had been offered that kind of money, would he have stayed? CBS was in preliminary negotiations for seasons 13 and 14. The cast, especially the core 5, were expected to earn around $50 million each, including profits if the deal went through. But Jim made his decision before formal contracts were ever drawn up. By the time season 12 wrapped, Sheldon Cooper's journey was complete. He'd won the Nobel Prize. He'd married Amy Farrah Fowler. He'd softened from the rigid, socially inept genius into someone capable of genuine friendship and love. He'd reconciled with his friends in one of the most emotional speeches in sitcom history. Jim compared it to finishing a great novel. You don't add extra chapters just because people love the book. You let the story end. So, he did. Looked around and he decided to walk away. But he did it in style. When the 2-hour finale of The Big Bang Theory aired, 18.5 million people watched it live. Millions more streamed it in the following days. It became one of the most watched scripted finales of the last decade. A fitting send-off for a show that had dominated television for 12 years. Jim was afraid he had made the wrong decision to leave, but he claimed never to have regretted it. Do you think he's being honest? Before Jim Parsons was the highest-paid actor on television, he was just a theater kid from Texas. Born March 24, 1973 in Houston, Jim grew up in the northern suburb of Spring. His mom was a teacher, his dad ran a plumbing supply company. He had a normal family and a normal childhood except for one thing. Jim knew from age 6 he wanted to be an actor. He performed in a school production of The Elephant's Child playing the Coca-Cola bird. And something clicked, he didn't just enjoy it. He knew with the kind of certainty most 6-year-olds never feel about anything that this was what he was supposed to do with his life. But after high school, fear began to creep in. So, he tried to give it all up. He enrolled at the University of Houston, but initially avoided theater, convinced it was too risky as a career choice. His decision seemed practical and responsible. It was the kind of decision that makes parents breathe easier at night. It lasted about 2 years. Jim realized one thing. He was miserable when he wasn't acting. So, he changed his major to theater and never looked back. During his time at University of Houston, Jim was prolific. He appeared in 17 plays across 3 years. He even co-founded Infernal Bridegroom Productions, a theater company that would stage dozens of productions before closing in 2007. He became a regular performer at the Stages Repertory Theater in Houston. The guy was obsessed. After graduating, Jim knew he needed more training. He applied to graduate schools, and landed a spot in a highly competitive 2-year program at the University of San Diego,